Hey everyone! Instead of doing a very information-dense tutorial on how to get a simple widget up and running, instead what I thought I would do is actually explore how the widget code works and what each piece of the code does. Because I think there's plenty of people on the internet who've done tutorials on how to do a simple widget, and even Apple has come out with some really nicely done videos on how to create your first widget. For example, if you just search the Apple developer website, you can find a lot of videos and explanations and example code on how to get started. So I thought that's already covered. So hopefully this will be a little bit more interesting in that we'll hopefully learn together how the widget code works instead of just focusing on cranking out a simple example and then getting stuck. So with that in mind, what I've done here is just created a simple project with the basic template code, which we don't really care about. And the first thing we need to do is create a new target. And we're looking for a widget extension. So we're going to add this to our project and call it widget. Let's call it widget test. It's just so it's a little more distinct. And we're going to add this to our project. And this is where we're going to spend all of the times we want to activate it. Yes. And as soon as we do that, it creates a new folder called widget test with the template boiler code of what creates our very simple widget. So like I said, instead of deleting all this code and then rewriting it and getting to the exact same place, I thought it might be interesting to understand what each piece of the code actually does, so we can have a deeper understanding of this functionality. And I haven't actually dived into the code almost at all, so it's going to be new for me too, but I thought this might be a helpful way to understand how to actually explore a new topic if you haven't been exposed to it. So it's honestly just going to be a lot of reading and a lot of messing around with the code just to get a better understanding of it. But hopefully that's interesting. If not, I won't do any more of these videos. But so anyway, let's see. This is the core of the widget code. And just to make sure that it works, let's run it on, let's say, iPhone 11 Pro. Okay, so here we go. We have a very simple widget. It just shows the time. And actually, something that I'm noticing right away is it's showing the time at the time of launch. So it was 5:49 when the widget launched, but it's already 5:50, and it actually hasn't updated. So that's something that I had heard about in that widgets don't support animation or dynamic changes. They can be refreshed, but you can't sort of see moving animations or things moving too much. They're sort of just static. And this kind of confirms it. But anyway, the good news is that we've gotten it to build and run successfully on our simulator. And that's pretty cool. So let's see what the code actually is. What do we have here? So as I just quickly scroll down, I see we have a piece called, it's a struct called a provider, a struct called a simple entry, a struct called widget test entry view, which is a view, and then we have our actual widget. So widget test is the name we gave it, and then we have it's of type widget. So this is actually, I think, our main piece of code that then depends on these other pieces up here. This is a preview, so this is only useful, I think, if we want to use the, sorry, not that, if we want to use a canvas for a preview, but we don't, so we don't really care about this. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of it. And This keyword, this at main catches my attention, and I think this is sort of like in the old days of Objective-C when you had an implementation file and you sort of had to say where your like implementation code began. I'm not 100% sure why it's here, but I'm going to keep it here. And I'm going to simply focus on this code and try to understand it. I'll move it to the top of the file just because logically it makes more sense to me that way, since this is the core piece of code that we need to understand. And what I'm going to do is actually all of this I'm going to comment out and see how the code breaks. So as soon as we do that, we see that stuff starts saying that it needs a provider and it needs a widget test entry view, which is this is our provider and this is our widget test entry view. Okay, so let's understand what's going on here. So we have a struct with a constant of kind, and all it is a simple string. So that's fairly straightforward to understand. Then within the body of the struct, we have something that is a widget configuration. And within that, we have something called intent configuration, which I'm not super familiar with, but the intent configuration has 1, 2, 3 pieces to it, 4 if we want to count this trailing closure. So so it needs a kind, it needs an intent, and it needs a provider, and then once we have some sort of a result, we plug it into this widget test entry view, which is widget test entry view. Okay. Still not super sure what this is, so I'm just gonna click on I'm gonna do an alt click to see what this says in the definition. Custom intent definition to provide user configurable options. Cool. Actually, if we do a option right click, it should take us straight to the definition of actually this is where it's been defined. Oh, but actually what I want is, sorry, I want this intent configuration. That's what I want. And we're in WidgetKit here, so if you actually click, this is the entire WidgetKit. It looks like the code. So here we see that in order to be able to use intent configuration, we need to give it an intent and a content. And the intent is of type something called in intent, and content is of type view. So, okay. That's fine. So here we're giving it for kind, all we're giving it is a string. That seems to be all at once, which is, I think this is just the name of your widget. It has to be like a unique string. So it knows which widget you're talking about. And then for intent, it seems to be, where does this come from? It's just some sort of a class called intent because it has to be intent. Okay. And then provider is going to come from down here. We'll look into that in a little bit. And then these two lines are simply, I believe, let's look at what happens if we click on that. It launches the app, but there's nothing inside it, so it's just hello world. But actually, what happens if we long press? Aha. So this is my widget goes, this is the title of your widget, and this is the description of your widget. So if we say my test widget, this is my first example widget, and then we do a run on that. Well, it won't work because we need to uncomment all of this. So now it should let's see. Let's remove it and try again. My test widget, this is my first example widget. Okay, so that's what this does. I'm going to go ahead and comment this piece of code again. Okay, so let's go look at what provider does. So I'm going to uncomment this piece of code right here. Okay, so provider is a struct of type intent timeline provider. Let's go check out what that is. So intent timeline provider is a protocol. And just as a refresher, protocols, when you define a protocol, you say what type of functions any other entity that conforms to the protocol needs to have. So we'll see here we have a function called placeholder, we have a function called getSnapshot, and we have a function called getTimeline. So for provider to conform to this protocol, intent timeline provider, it has to have definitions of these functions because that's what the definition of the protocol says here. But let's see if Apple seems to have provided a lot of comments. So for placeholder, it provides a timeline entry representing the current time and state of a widget. WidgetKit calls getSnapshot. Oh, so sorry, this is for snapshot. Represents the current time and state of the widget. WidgetKit calls getSnapshot when the widget appears in transient situations. That appears to be a widget gallery. In that case, call the completion handler as quickly as possible, perhaps supplying sample data if it could take more than a few seconds to fetch or calculate the widget's current state. Okay, so the way I read this is what WidgetKit actually calls to get an updated snapshot of your widget. But if it is something that's going to take a while because it has an escaping, I'm not sure what the term is, but if you have escaping, it means that it could be an asynchronous operation. So if you're fetching data from the internet or something, that's going to take time. And it sounds like if it's going to take some time to get the snapshot, instead it's going to show you the placeholder information. So this provider struct is going to give us a placeholder, something to show, if the getSnapshot function takes a long time. That's my understanding of this right now. And then let's see what getTimeline is. Timeline provides an array of timeline entries for the current time and optionally any future times to update a widget. The configuration parameter provides user customized values as defined in your custom intent definition. So again, this is not super clear to understand, at least for me on a first read, but it sounds like in timeline you need to give it a set of times when it goes to refresh the widget, which makes sense because if the widget only gets refreshed, it gets snapshots taken during certain times, you need to tell it when those snapshots should be taken. So the way I think about this now is the get timeline is where you need to tell it when to go fetch snapshots. If the fetching of the snapshots is taking a while, instead what you're going to see is the placeholder. So that's how the widget seems to be designed, the widget functionality anyway. And so yeah, let's see if we can try to understand this line by line. So So we need to say, give it a context, so just context, and we know that this function placeholder is going to output a simple entry. And simple entry is this thing right here. It's yelling at us because it's commented. But a simple entry needs to be given a date, because in this case, our widget is a clock. So if you think about what a clock requires, I'm guessing you need to give it a time of some sort. It's a bit confusing because we're talking about timelines and widgets, but in this case, we need a timeline to take a snapshot of the widget, which itself is a clock. So the terminology of timeline and the functionality of a clock is a bit confusing, but hopefully that makes sense. So our placeholder is a simple entry, which we need to give it a date, and we're giving it a date which is the current date. So that's actually what we see, I'm guessing. When we launch this widget, what's happening is we're actually seeing the placeholder, because when we launch it, it gives us the current time. And then it looks like in timeline, they're saying that generate a timeline consisting of 5 entries an hour apart, starting from the current date. So it sounds like this is going to get updated every hour for the next 5 hours, and that's when this is going to change. We can play with this just to see if we understand it correctly, by the way. But that's my understanding as of right now. So let's keep going. So in placeholder, this is our simple entry as just the current time and a placeholder configuration, really. There's no parameters being passed into this thing, so it's just kind of to make it work, as I understand. So that should be a simple placeholder. That makes sense. Under snapshot, what I see is we need to give it a configuration and a context again, like before. And we have an escaping clause here because we know that here we can do something that takes longer. In this case, we're not calling on an API or anything like that. So actually, this shouldn't be taking any time at all. And again, we have an entry that is a simple entry with a date of date and configuration of configuration. And this configuration gets passed into the, when you call the get snapshot function, it's of type configuration intent. Okay, so here what happens is you need to pass it a configuration. And then it takes a snapshot according to the configuration intent you pass into it. Okay, that makes sense. Because in timeline, we define when we want to run the get snapshot function and under what conditions. So that's where we pass it in, and then the output of this is a simple entry. And that simple entry is what actually gets displayed on the widget. Okay. Then get timeline seems to be entries. So we create a variable called entries, which is an array of simple entry. It gets initialized with an empty array. And then we create a current date, which is that. And then for our offset, we say from 0 to 5, do these things, and calendar current date by adding 1 hour, blah, blah, blah. And then we create an entry, which is a simple entry with the entry date, which is here, and a configuration of configuration. And then at the end, we append this entries we append this entry to the entries array up here. And then we say let the timeline equal an array of entries with a policy at end. this is something that I read a little bit about earlier, but there basically you have different options of when to run your get snapshot based on the different times that you've put into this array. And then when all this completes, then you call your completion handler, and you have essentially scheduled a number of snapshots that will happen at the given times over here. So that's basically it. What we have left down here is simple entry, which is a model. It's a struct of timeline entry. And here's where you define what you need to give it. You need to, essentially, it needs to have a date and a configuration. And then we have a view. This is the view that gets called here. And it's actually the view that gets displayed in the struct, in the widget. This is the actual widget view. And then all you get to show inside is a text that comes from the entry date, and it's a style, which is a time because we're dealing with time. Okay, hopefully that is helpful. By the way, all of this, if you get the definition of, let's say, intent timeline provider, and you start reading here, it's all incredibly well annotated, it looks like. So they've explained what each piece of code does really well. But overall, it seems relatively intuitive to understand. The one thing I want to understand is if we understand this well enough, we should be able to make some changes and predict what's going to happen. So let's see if we can get it to actually update instead of every hour, every second, let's say. So I think essentially this is where we create the schedule of updates, as I understand it, in this array. And currently what we're doing is we're adding a set of times, which are 1 hour after the current time. So 1 hour, 2 hour, 3 hour, 4 hour, 5 hours after the current time. And so if we say, yeah, like, let's do, yeah, like, let's do 5. 5 times, but instead of 5 hour increments, let's do second increments. And if that means that it should update every second for 5 seconds after the current time. So if we run this now, we should hopefully see it update. But unfortunately, so this only goes out to the minutes and doesn't show seconds. So it's obviously, even if it is updating, it's still going to show the same thing. But let's find a way to show the seconds. If we go into the widget test entry view, here's the text that we're actually showing. And just to prove that this is where it is, we can also we can do another text, but first we need to do like a vstack if we're going to have more than one text view. Let's say text. The time is, and now it should be, this should show up on the widget. There we go. Okay, so now we want to show the time but with seconds. So maybe if we change the style. It doesn't seem to have like a long time or anything like that. So what if we just do, what if we just make this embed this into a string? What are we gonna get? Running it again. Time is, okay, we just get all the data essentially. So we have we have the time as 6:48, 37 seconds, and it's not updating every second at all. So what do we actually need to have happen here is, let's try 10 here. Building it again. There we go. It's actually changing every second, and it should stop after 10 seconds. So it started around, I think it was like 14 seconds, so at 22, it stopped. Okay, so that is precisely what we expected to have happen. Essentially, we created an array with 10 different times, each a second apart, starting from the current time of launch. And during each of those predetermined times, we took a snapshot, which then at that time showed us the seconds changing because anyway, I think you get the point. So this is how it works. As a summary, we have our view here that is actually literally the text strings that you see in the widget. And this is where we determine how often it changes. This is the code for the snapshot and a placeholder if the snapshot takes too long. And this is the struct for initiating the widget, where you give the widget a name and the initiation, the different initial values, like what is it called when you click on it, what is the description, and so on. There's a lot more that we can do with this, but hopefully this was a helpful sort of exploration of the different bits of the code. And you can obviously go ahead and poke around more, and please share any comments or other ideas that you come across as you explore these. If you did like it, please give a thumbs up and subscribe so that I know that this is helpful and I can keep making more of the videos. Thanks.